guys, so today we're going to go over a very important part of American history. This is so important if you were to understand what's going on in the US nowadays, and especially like terms, like that come up often within the US news. Obviously the US is the superpower country as of now in the world, so you really have to get some basic ideas about key words, key phrases, key concepts that's related with the American politics and economy. So let's start. All right.
American dominance from 1945 to 1970. Introduction. Between 1945 and 1970, the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal continued to shape American politics. The New Deal increased the role of federal government, strengthened labor unions, and began the welfare state. Democratic President Trump, Kennedy, and Johnson supported the transition, while Republican Eisenhower also maintained it. Eisenhower once remarked that any party opposing social security or labor laws would vanish from American politics.
Right, so majorly we're going to go over these presidents, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, and Eisenhower. It's very important you actually know the dynamics of the two-party system, the Republican Party and Democratic Party, because the American politics swings a lot according to which party the president belongs to, the incumbent president belongs to. Now, as you know, Trump belongs to the Republican Party, and he has shifted so many policies in the American politics nowadays. So we're going to see how those great divides have been developed. But before we actually start, let's read this question together. Could you actually read this question?
Are the issues politicians debate most often political or economic?
All right, so this is the question that you have to keep thinking about as you go over the history, right? So you guys actually sit all together. Okay, could you actually sit over there? So yeah, so you guys sit in three. So let's have a discussion on this question for 1 minute before we actually start. Wake you up.
Daily life of the workers and people but other than it's all about the daily life and medical care, the resources of the workers.
When you are training to provide your people to public works, for example, for basic treatment, education, and also security, it's related to it. Then it began to public protest or people talk about that, they try to comment and they try to harm the authorities, and then it becomes
Okay, 1 minute. Okay, let's go to the material together. Arafat,
After World War II, shortages of consumer goods left American eager to buy products once they become available. Labor unions secured higher wages, allowing more families to purchase cars, homes, and household appliances. Between 1945 and 1973, real wages rose by an average of 3% annually, creating the longest sustained growth in US history. The prosperity created a growing middle class and expanded consumer society.
Right, so this is very important. You know that America sort of represents the consumer society of the world, they actually consume the most. The Americans consume the most, and that's why they have this huge death crisis nowadays. And why? Why has it been developed that way? It's because after the World War II and the First World War and the Second World War, of course, the Americans, actually they had a huge victory, right? So as a result of it, they got a lot of resources out of the war, participation though, because they were in the winning side. And what had happened was they had a big baby boom generation. So after the man, the soldiers came back home, they started giving birth. So there was a huge increase in terms of population. And also this is very important. I think you guys have to sort of remember this fact that from 1945, right after the World War II, to 1973, real wages. There's a nominal wage and real wage. So how do you calculate real wage? So nominal wage, say, it has been increased by 3%. But if there's an inflation, the prices of the, is it okay? No. Prices of the goods and products, what if they have increased by 4%? Is there an increase in the real wage or not? So there's a difference between the real wage and the nominal wage, right? So if you're getting paid 3% more than the last year, but then the stuff that you buy actually has been increased by 4%, right? Then you actually have no increase in terms of the wage because the stuff that you buy actually is more expensive than what you get, right? So the real wage is actually calculated roughly based on the inflation rate. So if you have a really high inflation rate, then there's a less chance that your real wages increase. But then, as you can see, the real wages in the U.S. it increased by 3% annually. What do you mean by this? Every year, there's a 3% increase every year. For how many years? Almost 18 years, almost 20 years, 2 decades. So there's a constant increase in your wage. It's the average, because that had happened. So that actually allowed a lot of money sources for each American family. And that's why they could consume a lot during the post-war period, right? And that sort of created a growing middle class. And you'll see, as a result of the war, as a result of the American politics at that time, a lot of government jobs were created, right? And that created a growing, sort of increasing number of middle class. So first, because of the increase in the disposable income, a lot of real wage increased, and also a lot of jobs were created at that time. So that gave the growth of the middle class in the U.S. Society, and that resulted in the huge increase in the consumption. So that created a consumer society as we know of the U.S. now. All right, so yeah.
Fear of communism and McCarthyism. Cold War tensions abroad created fear of communist infiltration within the United States. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed hundreds of communists held government positions, fueling the Red Scare. Intellectuals, entertainers, and even the U.S. Army faced accusations under his campaign. In 1954, the Senate.
Oh, we have to go out?
Shall I ask?
I think it's fine. Yeah.
In 1954, the Senate condemned McCarthy, but his actions left a legacy of fear and suspicion.
Yeah, so we've looked at the economic side, but political side is very important as well. Well, I think, yeah, could you go and ask? Yeah, fast for longer. All right, so you have to remember this term, Red Scare, all right? We'll actually read at the end of the first session the two primary sources that looked at the views of the Soviet Union and the views of the Americans on the Cold War, right? So that dynamic between the race between the Soviet Union and the U.S. created a huge sort of domestic politics dynamic, which is called Red Scare, right? I mean, it's happening in Korea as well. The Korean politicians have used the dynamics of the Cold War for their own interests, and that happened in the U.S. as well. So this senator Joseph McCarthy, McCarthyism is a term that you guys have to remember. So when you come up with this term, McCarthyism, and it's used a lot as a red scare, right? Not only for the American politics, but around the world. They actually say McCarthyism if there's a huge backlash against the communism, all right, or the socialism within the country, all right? So this senator, he actually used this huge fear about the communist infiltration into the American politics for his own interests. So he started accusing a lot of other politicians, like entertainers or like people who are influential, and then they started having the investigations, whether what he claimed was real or not. And at the end, it turned out that a lot of his claims were false. So it sort of died down. But still, a lot of American politicians used Red Scare in order to promote their own agenda. So it's not as strong as of now, like anymore, but it exists. And remembering this term, McCarthyism, is very important, okay? All right, Kennedy and Johnson.
Kennedy and Johnson's leadership. John F. Kennedy became the youngest elected president in 1960, inspiring optimism before his assassination in 1963. Lyndon Johnson, his successor, expanded the welfare state with programs for health care, education, and poverty reduction. Johnson supported the civil rights movement and worked to secure equality for African Americans. His Great Society vision aimed at ending poverty and racial injustice while improving the quality of life for all citizens.
Right, so I told you that there's a great divide between the Democrats and Republicans in the US, right? And because there was a war, and then the Americans actually won the two world wars, right? So they had a lot of benefits that resulted out of the wars. But then they also, because they had sent a lot of their men, as military people, and then they came back, and then of course, there's a boom in the economy. But at the same time, it sort of provided a faulty ground for the social welfare programs to be implemented in the U.S. So you have to remember that before the wars, the American politics were based on the federal system. It still is, right? But then the power of the federal government is the central sort of government which overrides all different states. So before the wars, the U.S. was based on a lot more power for each state. So they had the Californian state government, Washington D.C. Government, or Iowa state government. So there was a lot more power, assigned for each state government. But after the war, especially with the Democratic presidents, they started implementing a lot of social welfare system, right? Including the healthcare, education, and those bills, especially for the elderly and the poor people, right? And because the American politics started having this big government, it actually gave a lot more power to the federal government, which actually overrides the power that has been assigned to the state government. So you have to remember this dynamic, right? And I don't know whether you've heard about John F. Kennedy, but he was the youngest elected president in the U.S. So he was elected in 1960, but he was assassinated in 1963. A lot of people actually speculate that he was assassinated because he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve. Have you ever heard about Federal Reserve? Right? So Federal Reserve is the institution which prints out dollar bills. Right? For Korean 1 bill, it's been printed by the Korean Central Bank, 한국은행. for the US. It's not the federal government which prints out the US dollar bill, but it's the separate institution outside the US government which actually prints out the US dollar bill, right? So if Americans are in huge deficit in terms of their debt, they can actually print out a lot of dollars in order to offset the deficit. So the Federal Reserve and then the US government, they're separate. So technically speaking, the US government can influence how much money, how much dollars is printed, but they can't control because it's the Federal Reserve which actually prints out the money for the Americans. So there has been a lot of criticisms about the system itself, because it's not actually the Americans or the American politicians who have been elected by the American people who can control the American money. It's actually a separate institution which is sort of controlled by people who are not elected by the American people. There's a lot of Jewish conspiracy theory and stuff like that, but I won't go into the details. You just have to remember the Federal Reserve is not a government agency, okay? So, John F. Kennedy criticized this a lot, and there's a speculation that he was assassinated because he was so much critical about the Federal Reserve, and he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve. So, but then, exact reasons, no one knows. But because he actually died early, the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, he became a president in replacement of John F. Kennedy. And Lyndon Johnson actually is not as well known as John F. Kennedy, but he's quite important in implementing and actually expanding the social welfare system in the US. I told you that US was based on the states, so it's more like a combination of different states than a nation, one nation state. But Lyndon Johnson, he started implementing all this social welfare systems. He started giving out this Medicare for the elderly people, like national insurance for the elderly people. He started actually hiring a lot of government officials, as a result of the social welfare. And he actually supported civil rights movement. We're going to go into details about the American civil rights movement during the 60s and 70s. After the politics, we go over the politics. But you guys have to remember that Lyndon Johnson is the president who actually had this great society vision for ending the poverty. He was a very democratic president, so if you were to think about, the Democratic Party, you might have to think about Lyndon Johnson because he's like the president who actually started out all these welfare systems and all this civil rights movement extensively. So that sort of became the characteristics of the whole Democratic Party of the US. All right. Civil rights movement. So this is very important.
Civil rights movement. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown of decision that segregation in schools was unconstitutional.
Right.
Martin Luther King Jr. with peaceful protests, marches, and boycotts inspired by Gandhi's nonviolence. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places and workplaces. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 expanded access to voting for African Americans, particularly in the South.
Yeah, so if you want to understand the dynamics of the American sort of society, another very important aspect is the sort of conflicts between the African Americans and the white Americans. There's all this political dynamic or culture dynamics that centered around the divide between the African Americans and the Caucasian white Americans. And this is very important. So, that there was a war between the North and the South, and then that sort of led to the independence of the U.S. Colony from the British colony, and all this history, the Lincoln, but even though the North Confederation, which was led by the President Lincoln, won the victory. So they technically were trying to get rid of the segregations against the African Americans. culturally and socially, still a lot of segregations against the African Americans existed, right? And what had happened in 1954, there was a Supreme Court case about the segregation of the students, the African American students in the public school system. So you have to remember that America is very, very different from like what you actually imagine as of now. You think about like K-12 system, like very good like public school system in the US, but I told you that all these systems were in place in like 1960s and like the 1970s. So even before, like the school system was sort of based in the different states. So they had no sort of centrally controlled policies towards all public schools in the U.S. The different states had like different regulations and policies about their school system. So it was very decentralized, but especially in the southern region, where there was a big plantations, which hired Africans as slaves. There was a big slave plantations within the South. Because there was a huge sort of industrial connection. The culture-wise, there was still a lot of segregations that existed against the African Americans, right? So culturally, and in many of the schools in the U.S., they had different sort of classes and different different classes and different positions assigned for African Americans. So if you're an African American, you can't actually sit anywhere. You have to sit like at the back, or you have to be segregated against a different sort of lower sort of class. So there was a huge segregation. But then this one family, very brave family, they actually started a lawsuit against the policy, and then they actually won. So this Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, is very popular. And around the time, I don't know whether you've heard of this name, Martin Luther King Jr. is a very important civil rights movement activist, or he was a pastor of a church, but he basically gave a lot of speeches, and he gave a lot of peace movements against the segregation, but he was assassinated, right? So as a result of his assassination, there were like huge backlash. So a lot of African Americans started mobilizing their own demonstrations, and as a result of it, they actually enacted the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which expanded access to voting rights for the African Americans. So before, there wasn't even like voting rights for the African Americans. So all these like voting rights for the minority groups in the U.S. and also for women, they actually came in place after World War II. So it's a result of this huge human rights and social rights movement. Okay. All right. So let's have a discussion. So I'll give you 3 questions. You don't have to talk about all of them, but you can actually pick and choose 1 or 2 questions. And you can actually talk about these questions with the people next to you. All right, let's have it for 3 minutes. You can actually go and then have a discussion with the people at the back. reasons that I'm doing this exercise is because I don't want you guys to forget. I told you that if you were to just listen, then you tend to remember what the Bible says. But if you were to discuss, then you actually remember half of what you learned. That's why I want you to discuss, to make discussion, and speak it out.
As you say, worldwide normal also according to the
also they share how they feel and progress and they will reach. So the Soviet Union was not in Central America. They had a lot in the Cold War for the US. There was weapons and everything.
And some of the questions in the exercise reflections, they're going to come out in the exam. All right?
There's economies do a lot. They please take out low. And the economy
Elements,
get
you go into the area
bigger and
studies.
bigger. They take to the lows and highs. So that whatever American society, how to change people.
Go into the area
Is
studies.
this yours there? I thought it was here. It's sitting there but yesterday.
All right, let's go on. Let's move on. Okay. Whose turn is it?
Despite progress, African Americans in the North and West still face discrimination and higher unemployment. Race riots broke out in cities such as Los Angeles in 1965, leading to death and destruction. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 triggered riots in over 100 American cities. These events created a backlash among white Americans and deepened racial divides.
Right. So as a result of all this like unrest and all these riots and demonstrations, there's still a huge divide in terms of like psychological sort of divide, like emotional divide between the African Americans and the white Americans. And if you were to read like American literature, there's like American classic literature called like To Kill a Mockingbird. This actually selected as one of the key American classics that you have to read. This is just one example, but if you were to read a lot of American literature, they actually describe a lot of the divide and a lot of like unrest and these resentments shared by the African Americans. And this is a big part of the American history, like modern history as well. All right, another very important event that you have to remember is the Vietnam War and the American participation in the war. Whose turn is it?
The Vietnam War escalated under Johnson, leading to increasing opposition at home. Students' protests grew across the nation, culminating in tragic events such as the Kingston shootings in 1970. 4 students were killed when the National Guard fired into a crowd of demonstrators. Then the protesters reflect widespread disillusionment with government policies and divided the nation people.
Right, so I'm not going to go over the details of the Vietnam War and the American participation because I think it's dealt in some other classes, other classes in the area of studies, but I wanted to focus on what resulted in the American society and domestic politics as a result of Vietnam War. So, the Lyndon Johnson and the American politicians, they started to participate. They sent the the American military to the Vietnam, and a lot of the young people, they actually, especially the college students, they had a lot of like demonstrations, like anti-war campaigns within the campus, and that sort of created a movement of a student protests and demonstrations within the American university campus, right? So before, I think the American sort of universities were quite, it's not as like, vibrant as in terms of the social actions, but then Vietnam War was like a treasure of creating all these like student movements and student demonstrations within the campus. So a lot of campuses, and especially in the West Coast, like Berkeley, here they actually cited Kent State shootings, but they had a lot of other demonstrations that happened within the higher education campuses, and this actually created whole movement of the hippie movement, and so I think it's important for you guys to remember, because of the Vietnam War, there was a change of a student landscape, the social actions within the American society. And it's important that you remember the link, okay? All right, so we can actually think about these questions after we finish. And another important aspect is the women's rights movement. This has actually happened across the globe, but it's important that you remember that the American women's rights movement and the European women's rights movement, they have been influenced by one another, right? So another very important, I think, in terms of the social rights movement, is the increase of the women's right across the globe. And let's see how and why it happened. Whose turn is it? As well.
So women and social change. World War II brought many women into workforce, but they were often pushed back into traditional roles after the war.
Right.
By the 1960s, women earned significantly less than men for the same work across Western countries. The feminist movement gained momentum, influenced by Simone de Beauvoir's 1949 book *The Second Sex*. Women demanded equality in employment, education, and social rights, leading to the women's liberation movement.
Right, so women's rights movement, they actually existed before the two world wars, but it actually got the momentum after the war, because a lot of the men, they were sent to the military, right, and were killed, right? So during those big wars, it was the women who replaced the labor within the factories. So because a lot of women started working in the factories, so they actually had the earning power. Because they had earning power, because they started making money. And that's why it actually allowed them to have a voice in the political arena. So it's important that the wars actually gave these women voice to speak out their own rights, because they started earning money, and then they started realizing they can actually live off without their husbands, right? So and because there was an increase of the real wage, and a lot of government jobs were created, and the growing middle class all these social horizons, allowed the middle class woman to voice out for their rights. And there's an important book that you guys have to remember if you were to think about the women's rights movement. It's actually written by a French female writer. It's called Simone de Beauvoir. It's written in 1949, and it's called Second Sex. All right. So as a result of, it's not only this one, but there are like other British writers, other European writers, women, female writers. We actually started out just voicing for their rights, and as a result of all this movement, they actually got the voting rights, and then a lot of other social rights were granted as a result of it. All right, so and let's look at the student reports as well. Okay, whose turn is it?
Student reports. By the 1960s, more students from middle and lower classes entered universities due to reduced fees, overcrowded classrooms, and wage structures caused frustrations and discontent among students. Inspired by projects in the United States, European students staged revolts demanding reforms in both the United States and Europe. Students' movement peaked in 1968 but faded by the early 1970s.
Right. So before the 1960s, around like by like 1950s, the higher education, university education, was not readily available for general public. It was only for the elite class, right? But then because I think it's linked with all this changes in the social arena. You know, I told you that there was an increase in terms of the middle class, right, in the American society. So they had a lot more money to use for other purposes than just barely meeting their needs, right? And also, the American economy had a boom, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? So they needed a lot of high-skilled workers, in the white-collar jobs. So a lot more jobs were created. So because of the changes in the economy, a lot of universities were created out of the givings and the fundings from the government. And they actually lowered the tuition fee. So a lot more students enrolled in the higher education. And that sort of changes affected the European higher education scenario as well. But then, because of the Vietnam War and other changes, so you can actually say that the ages like 1960s and 1970s, all this period for Americans and Europeans were described as the period of the human rights. So there was a huge sort of demonstrations, huge movements and campaigns for human rights movement that included not only for the women but for the African Americans, the other minority people, right? So, and it actually, if you were to think about the most progressive group in the society, is mostly the university students. And that image was created around this period. Because there were a lot more students in the higher education, a lot more students in the universities, and of course, these university students had a lot more time than you guys. I think university students nowadays are a lot busier, But then at that time, it wasn't as competitive. Right? So they had a lot more time to read books, and a lot of these books were very progressive. They were just voicing for the human rights and the rights of all these other people than the white man. So they became sort of the harbinger. They became the crux of all this social rights movement. And it sort of, but then after 70s and 80s, it sort of died down because these university students they started working. And once you start working, once you have your careers, you don't really have as much time, right? So it was the peak, 1970s, that was the peak, but then it sort of died down afterwards. But then it's still, the image of university students being the most progressive group in the society was created as a result of this social change. All right, whose turn?
The middle class expanded rapidly as incomes rose and new professional occupations emerged. Industrial workers declined while white-collar and service jobs increased in number. Consumerism became central to society with cars, televisions, and household appliances symbolizing prosperity. Buying on credit became common, fueling the growth of a consumer-driven culture.
Right. So I told you that after the two world wars, because of all this change, the middle class, the higher and higher real wages, the consumer society was created. But it's very important for you guys to remember how Americans consume, because they actually consume not based on their income. They actually consume based on their credit. What do you mean by credit? They use credit cards a lot, right? I mean, credit card is just one kind of the credit system, you know? So they expect that they would actually get more money, right? Because there was an increase, 3% increase every year for almost 20 years, for 2 decades. So they actually expected that, you know, if we, okay, like next month, next year, my wages will increase, so I can actually spend more than I earn. And this has become a common practice in the US. So that's what defines the consumer society in the US. So they actually spend a lot on their credits. And that created a lot of the debts, right? So American consumerism, American consumption has been able to increase as a result of the credit system, because they always expected that, you know, their wages will increase. But that created a huge momentum of huge debt crisis. And a lot of economic policies that Donald Trump is actually maneuvering nowadays is a result of the huge debt that was created out of the credit system. So America has the most debt in the world. And it's because they were able to print out their money. You know, they can actually print out their dollar bills because it's actually controlled by the Federal Reserve. And the presidents and the American Treasury, the governments were trying to influence the Federal Reserve so that, they can actually print out more money or reduce the amount of money being printed. And, they actually do this fiscal policy out of the debt that has been created by the American people. So understanding that this consumer society has been created as a credit system is very important. This is what defines the American sort of economy. And it's been exported to other nations, developed nations, okay? All right, so I'll just deal with Canada just one page because we don't have time. Who's next?
Canada and American influence. Canada shared post-war prosperity and expanded its industries with American investment. Some Canadians feared U.S. domination of their economy and culture. Canada developed its own welfare state with programs like the Canada Pension Plan and National Health Insurance. Canadian leaders sought to balance close ties with the United States while maintaining national identity.
Right, so Canada is a completely sovereign nation independent of the US. But as you can see, the Donald Trump said it's gonna, the US can include, basically combine Canada as one of the other, additional states. So Canadians are always being threatened by the American influence, because it's bordering. But then if you were to compare US and Canada, Canada has a lot better and a lot more extensive social welfare system, right? So they actually get a lot more, they give a lot more pension, national pension, they actually give free medical services to all their citizens. The public education is completely free, so it's a lot more welfare-based society than the US, and as a result of it, the tax rates are a lot higher, right? So and then the culture-wise is a lot more like liberal and progressive, very tolerant. So if you were to travel to Canada, you will actually feel that the culture there is a lot more tolerant towards the immigrants, towards the foreigners, and it's a very friendly country. All right, so conclusion. Who's right here?
So between 1945 and 1970, the United States experienced economic growth, civil rights advances, and social upheaval.
Right.
The Vietnam War and racial tensions divided the nation, while student and women's movements demanded reforms. Despite turmoil, the era demonstrated the resilience of democracy and the power of protest to bring change This period laid the foundation for ongoing debates about equality, rights, and the role of government in American life.
Right, so the last sentence, which actually says about the equality, rights. Of course, the rights here means minority rights, so like women's rights, like African American rights, and the roles of government. These are the key issues that divided the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, right? So for the Democratic Party, if you to think about Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, those are the presidents of the Democratic Party. So they are more for equality, more for minority rights, and more of the expanded roles of the government. And the Republican Party is actually the opposite, right? So you have to remember the divide. But you can see how those how this divide has come from. As a result of the World War II, the experiences, and also the Vietnam War, and as a result of it all, there's like movements by the student movements, women's rights movements, and all these changes. But these changes within the U.S. actually affected mostly the Europeans, but also the whole world, especially the consumerism, the consumer society model, the consumption based on the credit. That's been exported to a lot of other countries, and that's how the world economy is being defined nowadays. Most of the advanced, developed societies, like South Korea, we actually live on our credits. Not on our real income, but actually on the credit expectation that how much we're gonna earn in the future. All right. So I told you that the purpose of going through all these different regions in the world is for you to get acquainted with the key terms that come a lot in the news, all right, or that come a lot in the literature, all right. So I want you guys to remember these key phrases: welfare state, role bloc. The bloc means the communist bloc, the liberal sort of democratic bloc. The real wages I explained, civil rights movement that included the women's rights movements, African American movements, and the students movement. Consumer society I explained, and women's liberation movement. Like Simone de Beauvoir was booked, but then there were other women writers as well. And important figures, important people in the American history around this time: John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Simone de Beauvoir is not American, but her work influenced a lot of the women's rights movement. So I want you to understand what these key phrases and key people represent, okay? And then when those terms come up, you can actually understand the background, and that's going to help you to understand the literature. But the key phrases is most likely that they will come up in the exams, okay? So I just specified them. Okay, so okay, we have